So I'm going to talk to you today about the sort of an overview of project management from all through the process and talk about the various tools that can be used during the process. The reason I'm doing that is that I want you to understand that it's the big picture associated with it before we dive into the particular tools. So you can see here I have 4 sort of sections identified, and I think we've talked about this before. I think I went over it in class a little bit. So the first one is initiation, and I think I'd called that definition before, but the idea is at the beginning when you're actually defining what project. The second section is planning, the third is execution of the project, and the fourth is closure. And you can see there's kind of overlapping times associated with that, and then the project timeline you can see going from left to right. So let's look at initiation first. So there's a couple forms that are used often in initiation. There's the main one is a project charter or project definition form. And there's other forms too, like a stakeholder analysis matrix or responsibility matrix or something like that. But generally it's the project charter where people decide ahead of time what they've agreed to and what the expectations are associated with it. Let's move on to planning. So in the planning phase, there's also several tools that are used. One is a work breakdown structure. So you can see this is kind of like a hierarchical look at all the items that need to be done. And they're divided in this case into 4 main categories. And then beyond that, there's subcategories. And then beyond that are smaller subcategories. Each of those boxes at the very bottom level is what's known as a work package or an activity. And so each of those activities then, after you've done a work breakdown structure, you have some sort of activity attributes. And this has to do with how long it's going to take, maybe the precedence, like one has to come before the other. It also has some information about cost and responsibility. So those all need to be defined. All of those activities at the very bottom of the, right along here, all of those need to be defined in great detail by an activity's attributes. And then beyond that, you also might have some sort of tool that looks at the durations of all the activities. And from that, you can look at also costs associated with it. So costs, and if there's any resources that are needed, people or tools or materials. So you might want to have something like that. From that, you also would have a risk management plan. So really understanding what are the risks of the project, what could go wrong in the whole process. And that requires a lot of analysis, including some sort of contingency analysis. There also might be a change management plan where you look at what if we want to change the project, who gets to do that and who decides on that. After all this is done, you then will create something like a Gantt chart, which is a timeline similar to this timeline where I have activities associated with here. It's the same here, but each of these activities are scheduled on a timeline, and there's also some precedence associated with it, like this one needs to be finished before this one begins. There's often a line that sort of shows you where you are in the process, what's been completed and what hasn't been completed. So it's a lot of detail associated with the Gantt chart, but it is a very common tool for planning a project. Another tool might be a project network analysis. We probably won't use this, but we will go over how this works because it is a tool that people often use in very complex projects. But a network analysis is sort of done instead of a Gantt chart. So we'll move on to execution. So now in this case, you have already initiated the project, you've decided and had agreement. Then this is where you're going to be planning the project. Now you're getting into the actual doing of the project. And you can see that actually doing does overlap planning a bit. But let's look at execution. So you might have status reports along the way. Somebody will tell you where they are with that periodically, weekly, daily. It depends on how the project is moving ahead. You also might have some sort of change request. So if somebody has a change in the project scope or a change in responsibility, maybe they want somebody else to do a particular task, they will then have some sort of change methodology. This would be a change request. They might have some team contact information, like who are you, how do you get a hold of each other. You actually probably already have this, and it might actually be done in the initiation phase. And maybe it's some performance assessment. Maybe there's some place where you want to give people feedback about how they've done in the project. You also want to keep track of issues logs. So when have things come up that needed to be addressed and how did you resolve those associated with the plan? Maybe there was a particular tool that you needed and you needed to go buy it because somebody hadn't done it, you might want to look at how did that happen and how did we resolve it. The next thing is also a Gantt chart. So I showed you this in the planning phase, but also a Gantt chart is also used in the execution for controlling the project. Then also you might want to look at schedule, variance, quality, schedule, cost, and quality variance. So looking at where you are right now in the project and how is that according to plan. So the actual versus the plan. And you want to look at it in all three of these dimensions. The schedule, are you on schedule? The cost, have you spent more than you thought you would? And how's the quality going? So that is definitely something you want to use in the control of the project. You also want to do risk or safety audits to make sure that people are being safe and there's not issues associated with safety. Then we move to closure. So we want to do a contract closeout. And there's a couple ways you might do that. This is one of the tools, one of the forms that I have. Another might be a project closeout to actually say this is what we did, this is what we completed. You also want to make sure that you document lessons learned. So looking at what went right and what went wrong. And that's pretty much the tools that I wanted to show you associated with that. So what I'd like you to do now is actually look in your books and match up the tools that you have in your books with the tools that I just presented, so that we can then sort of compare and contrast and see if there's any other tools that we might think would be important for a project plan. The next thing then we'll do is look at detail in the project charter.